Hello, my name is Casey, and this is slightly odd. This is my first time doing a video for this podcast, so you'll have to forgive me if things are a little wonky. I'm still figuring everything out. Also, I have my handy dandy computer here with me that has all my notes on it, so if I'm not looking directly at the camera, I apologize. But welcome! Welcome! This is going to be a podcast that focuses on all things spooky, mysterious, things that you may see on the side of the road that you probably don't want to stop for. That's the vibe. That is the vibe. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Today's episode is the beginning of a multi-part series that will be, it's a work in progress. All right, I'm doing a few things at a time right now, so it might be a little rough to begin with. But to start out with, like I said, today's podcast is the first part of a series that I'm going to be doing called 50 Nifty Cryptids, where I talk about a cryptid from each state in the US. And I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I'm actually really, really excited. So let's get into it. All right. Also, yeah, like I said, didn't I say I'm your host? I'm Casey. I thought I said that, but now I'm second guessing myself. So, if you guys hear meowing, that's my cat. I can see him trying to sneak in. The door is slightly open. Anyways, for this episode, you all know your states. At least I hope you do. We are diving in to the deep woods, the cold waters, and desert skies, and swampy edges of the map with Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, and I'm gonna tease a little bit of Arkansas because I don't think we're gonna have time to get into that today. So lock your doors, or don't. I'm not your dad. But you may want to go take a peek out your window really fast before we get into this, because we are going to Alabama. Our Alabama cryptid is known as the White Thang. And yes, that is Thang because regional pronunciation is important. And that honestly makes it like probably 10% more alarming because Thang, God, it sounds so stupid. Thang rhymes with fang, okay? And White Fang was a really sad story, and hearing White Fang makes me think of sad and scary moments. So I think we're into it already. All right, back to business. Stories about the White Thang have been around since at least the early 1900s, with reports popping up around the 1930s and 1960s, but there's been minor reports and, little sightings for who knows how long, but it started in the 1900s. It's also sometimes called the Sloth Thing or Slow Thing in Lawrence County in Alabama, because people may believe that it may live in a very specific area around Big Nance Creek. And that's where things get pretty cool with this story, is that the mayor herself, Cortland Mayor Linda Peebles, said at one point that her mother during the Great Depression saw the Slow Thing or White Thing. And so that kind of gives it a little bit more credibility in my personal, very unprofessional opinion, is that you have someone in a position of power saying, hey, no, like I have family members who have seen this thing. Descriptions of the White Thing vary wildly, which, is pretty common for cryptids. Someone can say, oh, I saw it and it looked like this, and another person the next day can say, I saw it and it did not look like that, it looked like this. Some people describe it as roughly 8 foot tall, very Bigfoot-like, and white with long hair, whereas other people describe it more as like a white big cat or a cougar, or even weirder, a kangaroo-like creature with a cat's head, which is very hard to picture, but I can kind of see it. The sloth thing is usually described a little bit smaller, probably more around 5 feet tall, standing on 2 legs. But most reports say that it does have glowing red eyes. And there are also reports of a smell that is associated with it. So like a rotten, fishy smell, which is very yucky, but one of the, another Bigfoot sign is that lots of Bigfoot sightings typically have some sort of rank, wet smell with them. And the sound is really weird and not very Bigfoot-like is the thing. The sound is usually reported to be high-pitched like a woman's scream. And that detail specifically made me think of big cats or even just like larger felines, because you have your cougars and you have your bobcats, specifically in North America, or at least in the US, that both make sounds that sound like a screaming woman. And there's also the long-running stories of, in like southern US and South America, American black panthers, which there have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sightings throughout history, and yet there's never been like a real bona fide sighting, which is super weird. But anyways, we have them. I think we have black panthers in the US. I just think that they're never really seen. But that being said, you're not going to go look and see if it's a cat screaming outside or if it's some sort of supernatural creature screaming outside, because none of us are that stupid. At least I would hope. The white thing is reported to be extremely fast also. Reports have said that it can climb trees super easily, extremely fast. It can jump fences, which is really not great. And then some reports also say that it moves on all fours in comparison to upright or, more like humanoid, hominid, like Bigfoot or a skinwalker, like all the things. But there is this really weird main sighting area within Alabama, in between, I think it's Morgan, Etowah, and Jefferson counties, which are all in the southern Appalachians, I believe. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Alabama in general gives a lot of places for a creature like this to hide, because as of 2020, I think Alabama had reported 23 million acres of forest land. 23 million acres. That's a lot of woods. It's a lot of woods. And then not to mention you have the massive, extensive cave systems as well, to where just because you can't find it up above, within the tree line and stuff like that, does not mean that it's underneath you, which is also not great. So it's not hard to believe that just because it's not hard to believe that it could be somewhere, it could, there's so many places it could be. It could be here. It could be in Alabama. So many places that it could be. One sighting from the 1960s involves a woman and her sister driving home from a church outing that they had been at near Brompton and Moody, which I failed to double check before I started this podcast. I believe they're towns, or they're obviously their areas, but I believe they're towns. They saw eyes in the road and they slowed down, as you're gonna do because you think it's a deer. It's Alabama in the middle of the night. There are deer about. But instead, they saw something really big and white. They saw what one of the women described as a bear with an angry man's face, which is really weird, and like the kangaroo with the cat's head idea, really hard to imagine. It kind of sounds like it would be in my room during a sleep paralysis episode. Not great. And then the creature also ran across the road on all fours as they came up on it. And apparently the women were terrified and turned around and went back to the church, and they sent men out and nobody ever found anything, which they're not going to. Not shocking whatsoever. And I hate that whole situation deeply, specifically the bear with the man's face part. That's really gross to me. And another story involves an older woman who lived alone with her dog, a German Shepherd, and I believe this was an account of the neighbor. He was asleep the entire time, but he had grown up with this woman living next door, and he heard the story. But anyways, it was this older woman, and she lived alone with her German Shepherd, and she heard something moving around in her garden one night in the middle of summer, and she went outside to investigate. She had picked up a garden hoe and went outside to investigate, and when she went outside, her dog, which was normally very confident and almost borderline aggressive, words of the neighbor of course, was sitting there on the porch and was cowering and would not get off the porch, didn't want to go with her, didn't want to do anything. And so went past the dog, and she went down into the garden, and she spooked this thing, and it jumped up and just bolted down in between the two houses on all fours. And it was big and it was white. And like I've said, we don't have anything that is big and white in Alabama unless there is a zoo in Alabama that has a polar bear that has escaped. Not likely. So what is it? What is it? Could it be a misidentified animal? Is it really a cryptid? I'm not sure. I don't know why a big cat would be rooting around in a vegetable patch, some sort of leucistic big cat, which I will probably talk about genetics and random nerd facts on this show as well. Leucism is basically the opposite of melanism. It's not when you're an albino with pink eyes, to where there's genuinely no color production in your skin. Leucism is when you're just more white color presenting rather than more black color presenting with melanism. So your leucism, you're going to have your white hair and your blue eyes, but you're not just lacking pigment, which it does happen in big cats a lot, both ways. That is a genetic factor. So who knows? Like I said, I don't think a big cat's going to be rooting around in your vegetable garden unless it has somehow found a rabbit that has made its way into a wrong place, wrong time type of moment. I don't know if it's a bear. I feel like the reports of it being on all fours are more common than it being bipedal like a Bigfoot. I genuinely could not find very many reports at all of it being bipedal like a Bigfoot. So it's a weird one with not a lot of reports behind it, not a lot of information behind it. That's probably going to be about how half of these stories are, or half of these cryptids are, just because some of this stuff is just family lore that's passed down, which is super cool. It's just sucks that there's not more information on any of them. But either way, if your dog doesn't want to leave the porch, maybe listen to your dog because they know. So next, we are leaving the woods, and we are going very, very, very up north to the tippy top, down all the way up north to Alaska. And in Alaska, we meet the Tizheruk, also known, and I am going to butcher this, as the Palrayuk or the Tizheruk. So reports of this creature come from the Bering Sea area, which is basically off of the coast of Alaska, in the Pacific Ocean. And most of the significant reports came around from Kings Island and Nunavut Island. This creature was first reported and more brought into the more modern cryptid discussion in I think it was 1980 by John White and Roy P. McCall. And John White is a wonderful name for a cryptid investigator. You could not get more bland than that. Unlike some sea monsters, like your krakids and your mermaids and your sirens, which mermaids and sirens are arguably two different things. The Tizheruk is more reported around bays rather than out in open ocean, which is a little bit scarier to me because with your bay, you have more just low, gross, scary. I do not like the ocean. The ocean does not like me. Tizheruk is often described as having a rather oversized seal-like head, or maybe even snake-like head, with a seal-like tail, or even more salmon-y, like a fish tail. And nobody really knows what the body looks like because you never see the full thing. You usually only ever see the tail or the head. But you see the head enough to know that it can raise about 7 or 8 feet out of the water, as some reports have said. So that's fun. But they believe that maybe the full body length from tip to tail may be, I don't know, like 15 feet long, which is, that's a big thing to be swimming around in the water where it's cold. And other versions describe it as like this kind of giant worm-like animal, which is worse somehow, because just worms in the ocean, not a fan. And supposedly you can attract it by slapping your hand or an oar or, something against the edge of your boat or against the side of your boat, which sounds like the worst idea possible to me, because the Tizheruk is said to be able to basically snipe you and is completely silent when it hunts, can slip into the very, very shallow creek beds, even though it's much larger than the creek bed itself. Some reports say it can shapeshift, and that's how it's able to get into spots it's not supposed to be in. And yeah, completely silent, terrifying for me. Because what if you were on a dock and you were just having the time of your life, just saying, oh, da 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 da, going fishing, and then all of a sudden you're in the water. You didn't hear it come out of the water. You're just in the water, and there is a giant seal-like serpent dragging you down to the depths of the ocean. No thanks. No thanks. And it's interesting also because supposedly that noise, the slapping noise on the side of a boat, can also attract leopard seals, which leopard seals are only in the southern hemisphere. They're in the Atlantic Ocean. As far as I know, they don't exist in the northern hemisphere, and they don't have any, there's no other pinnipeds, which are the kind of seal that a leopard seal is, the long-necked eared seals. We don't have any of those in the northern hemisphere. None that would be even remotely close to a leopard seal. And if you've ever seen Happy Feet, you know how horrendously vicious leopard seals can be. That I don't think that movie really exaggerated that at all. They're terrifying. So the Tizheruk itself is interesting because it mostly comes from Inuit and Inupiaq traditional stories and legends, to where the accounts vary and not every detail is really confirmed. But I believe the Inupiaq translation of the Tizheruk is the long-tailed one. So some stories really just treat the Tizheruk as something completely mythological and not, like a real cryptid or unknown animal. And like I said, in some stories it's a shapeshifter, and it's silent. It's silent as death. And there's even a taboo around the name itself, to where if people think that if you speak that name out loud, it's like SWs, to where if you speak that name out loud, you might bring bad luck on yourself, or you might even have a treat to come face to face with it, which is not what I'm down with. But it's also important to remember that with legends, especially native legends, that there's usually some sort of lesson or story that comes with it, to where, in my opinion, and I believe how it's supposed to be interpreted in general, is that the Tizheruk is more of a reminder of humanity itself and its balance with nature. Just because we're at the top of the food chain, it does not mean that we've got this high horse that we can be up on. There has to be a balance, and it doesn't mean that you're not susceptible to unforeseen circumstances, especially not in places like the Bering Sea, to where, you have ice and snow and water and weather and animals and like all these things to worry about and look out for. You have to remember that you may think you're the big bad, but there's other things that could mess you up. But from a cryptozoology angle, Roy Mackal suggested that it could be some sort of prehistoric seal or, a long-necked seal, like I was saying. And I'm sure someone is saying, well, we have sea lions. Sea lions are not seals. They are two completely separate animals. They may look exactly the same. They are completely different. Completely different. And that is a whole oceanography mammal taxonomy deal that I am not willing to get into right now. And there's also been, more recent sightings and footage. I think it was Paranormal Caught on Camera or on whatever that show is, that showed in 2016 the Alaskan Bureau of Land Management had released a video of this like really weird large serpentine shape moving up the Chena River near Fairbanks, and official explanations lean towards debris or, possibly a school of fish, but obviously that is a dumb excuse, because where in the world has it ever just been a pile of debris? A lot of times. But cold water hides things very well. It distorts things, it distorts movement. It can turn logs into serpents and seals into monsters. I mean, it really could be anything, but I think the lesson behind the Tizheruk itself is a very important lesson that we all need to remember. So at least there's that, So now we're heading south out of the icy water and into the sky. And Arizona gives us one of the most dramatic figures in North American legend, which is the Thunderbird. And I do say Arizona, it's not all Arizona, but Arizona claims it as its cryptid. So we're going to roll with it. And yeah, so the Thunderbird. No, not the car. The Thunderbird is this massive, massive mythological bird with origins in many Native American traditions. Like, there are so many tribes that I could not list them all. But as far as I know, and I may have this all wrong, Google is free, but it does not always tell you what you need to know, and finding cryptozoological reports are hard enough as it is. The Sioux, the Anishinaabe, and the Menominee, many other peoples, like all across North America, all across the US, so many people, so many tribes have stories of the Thunderbird, which I think is really, really, really cool, because that means that, someone, if there is a tribe in Maine, but if we're going off of that, maybe a tribe in Maine or Vermont, Virginia, has some kind of the same story as a tribe down in Arizona or New Mexico, which is just crazy to me, because that's just wild. Different cultures, different everything. But it's in that sense that it's a little bit different than your typical cryptid, because in many of these traditions, the Thunderbird is not just some animal that is hiding in the wilderness. It is a spiritual being and a force of nature. And because Thunderbird traditions and legends are so prevalent and widespread across North America, there's no real true, like, one legend that you can pin down or a single version of it. But generally, the Thunderbird is associated with storms and power, protection, and the sky itself. It's said that thunder can come from the beats of its wings as it flies across the sky, and that lightning may flash from its eyes or its beak as it screams. And it's often seen as a protective spirit and a guardian of humanity, and a symbol of just strength and leadership and divine power, which is really, really cool. And there's also this reoccurring theme of the Thunderbird battling, supernatural underwater creatures like horned serpents or, underwater panthers. Crazy, I know. But, these stories often represent a cosmic struggle between sky powers and water powers, or like, beings of sky and beings of water. And it's super cool. And I am, not Native American, so I don't want to butcher any of these stories, so I'm not going to delve too deep into them, but you should look into it more. It's crazy. In these traditional stories, the Thunderbird is, massive, and not like big bird outside your window massive. It's like, it's big enough to carry whales massive, big enough to create storms by just flying across the sky. And that's insane enough, but in the cryptid world, Thunderbird sightings are usually more treated as reports of enormous unidentified birds, seen across North America. And these sightings often describe dark feathers, an eagle-like head, a condor-like body, and wingspans from, 15 to 30 feet long. And for comparison, the largest living bird in North America is the California condor, and it can have a wingspan of, I think, roughly 9'3", which is, 9 feet. That's a big bird. It's a big bird. But 30 feet is roughly the length of a semi-truck trailer. Can you imagine seeing a bird with the wingspan of a semi-truck trailer flying across the sky? I can't. I can't personally. One famous report from these, from Thunderbird sightings is the Arizona giant bird story from, I believe it was 1890, where a newspaper claimed that a group of cowboys had killed this gigantic flying creature with, a huge wingspan, some kind of reptilian appearance, and almost like bat-like features. Which I genuinely, like, if that story is real, I can't think of any animal that could have been. And that story specifically is obviously treated with a lot of skepticism. It has all the ingredients of some kind of, Wild West tale, and there's no surviving evidence. So there's a lot of people that believe that these cowboys were just bored and made something up, but who am I to judge? I'm not here to make decisions. I'm just here to tell the tales, And not to mention, bored people come up with some of the best folklore, as it is. Another well-known Thunderbird report comes from Illinois in 1977, when multiple witnesses described seeing a large, dark bird flying low altitude with massive wings. And there was a show that came out a few years ago that I can't quite remember what the name was, but I believe they were doing cryptid sightings and all of that, and they interviewed this guy who said that as a child, he was picked up by a Thunderbird and like lifted off the ground for a few feet and then dropped again. And if I remember correctly, I think he had scars on his shoulders to show, that he had proof. And obviously they were a lot thinner and stuff because he was a child and now he's a grown man. So scars get thinner as you grow in age if you get them as children. But I don't know. Now, realistically, there is no living bird in North America that is large enough and has a large enough wingspan to pick up a child, even for just a few feet. But the key word there is living. Because if you go back into prehistory, that's where things get really cool and interesting. Because millions of years ago, there were enormous birds that make our modern day birds look minuscule, look like your little parakeet or budgie sitting on your finger like this. There was the Argentavis, which is, I think, the largest bird to have ever been known, prehistory or current history, because it had a wingspan of around 23 feet, and that fits right in the range of some Thunderbird sightings. And there was also Territorinus, which lived much closer to modern times during the Ice Age, and it had a wingspan of more like 12 to 13 feet, so not as big, but fossils have been found in North America. So is it possible that some sort of prehistoric bird, survived into modern times and became the source of Thunderbird sightings? It's It probably not, but it's possible. Who am I to say? But, you know, that's what that's what makes the Thunderbird just so incredibly powerful as a cryptid and as a legend, is just that it may not be just, some sort of maybe animal. It's also extremely spiritual and cultural and symbolic and legendary. It belongs to stories about the natural world being alive with power. So, when modern cryptid hunters talk about thunderbirds as giant birds in the sky, it's important to remember that the roots of the thunderbird are much, much older and deeper than just some weird sighting. And honestly, if I saw a 30-foot bird pass over me in the desert, I would not be pulling out a measuring tape. I would be on the ground rethinking every choice that had led me there. Next time we return to 50 Nifty Cryptids, we are heading down into Arkansas for the Folk Monster, a swampy southern kind of Bigfoot-like legend that it has lots of strange tracks, terrifying encounters, and a creature that became famous for the little town that it haunted. But for tonight, I think we already crossed a lot of strange ground. We met Alabama's white Thang, pale and fast, screaming like a woman, and smells like rotten fish. Kind of gross. We went through Alaska's cold bays with the Tizheruk, the long-tailed one, silent as death, and maybe even better left unnamed. And we looked into Arizona's storm-dark sky with the Thunderbird, a being that is bigger than a cryptid, older than a sighting report, and powerful enough to turn wing beats into thunder. Whether these stories come from misidentified animals, old memories, spiritual traditions, newspaper exaggerations, or something stranger, they all do the same thing. They remind us there are still woods people avoid at night, waters where people lower their voices, skies that feel just a bit too wide, and roads where something pale crosses just beyond the headlights. And I think that is the slightly odd part. Thank you for listening to Slightly Odd. If you enjoyed this episode, keep your eyes open, keep your porch light on, and maybe do not slap the side of a boat unless you are completely ready for whatever wants to come out of the water. I will see you next time, or something else sees you first. Good luck.